Hello, and welcome back to TDNY, This Day, Not Year, the podcast where we look at the history of the week ahead. Episode 6, which means I've been doing this for over a month now. For those who've stuck around since episode 1, thank you. Your support means the world, truly. That said, if you're new around here, there's no better time to start. As each episode, I get a little more competent at this whole podcasting thing. For this episode, it'll be more of what you know and hopefully love, but also a new addition to look forward to. So remember to take notes along the way. So, with that said, what else do we have to look forward to today? I'm glad you hypothetically asked, as on this episode, we learn what purpose a porpoise posed at Project Sealab, when a cow could fly, a moose flopped, and what a dirty thunderstorm is. And as per usual, a whole lot more along the way. So, let's start off with Monday, the 17th of February. And on this day, not year, 4 divers go down to fix a leaking submersible, but only 3 would return. Was this just an accident? Or was something more sinister going on? Was this planned? Was this murder? The year is 1969. And while the space race is nearing its zenith, being just months away from Neil Armstrong taking one small step for a man, another race had been going on. This one wasn't as showy, wasn't nearly as well funded, and the pressure was far greater. But for those involved, it was just as important and just as dangerous. This was the world of aquanauts, and their attempts, to quote Homer Simpson, to start a new life under the sea. First off, what is an aquanaut? Fortunately, it's really as simple as it seems. If an astronaut sails the stars, an aquanaut dives beneath the sea. To qualify, you need to be a diver that has stayed at saturation for 24 hours. That is to say, breathing in gas long enough that the inert properties have dissolved into your tissue. This dissolved gas is completely harmless, so long as you stay submerged. If a diver surfaces too quickly, the pressure changes on the body and trapped gas leads to decompression sickness, also known as the bends. Best case, it'll be quite painful. Worst case is death, so best avoided. The first aquanaut was Robert Pierre-André Stenu, spending 24 hours underwater at a depth of 61 meters or 200 feet in 1962. But he won't be the focus for today. Neither will the second or third attempts of a team led by Jacques Cousteau. No, today we're off to join the Navy. Well before the first aquanaut, Gordon F. Bond of the US Navy had been studying the same problem. One of the biggest issues with living underwater is the atmosphere. You'd think it would be as simple as filling up on oxygen tanks and off you pop. Unfortunately for us, pure oxygen is toxic under the pressures found underwater. The trick is to mix it with nitrogen to keep the percentage down low enough to not be toxic. Only after a certain depth and pressure, nitrogen turns toxic too. A third gas was required. Now, on the surface, we aren't breathing pure oxygen. Around 21% of what we breathe is O2, while 78% is nitrogen, N2, and the remaining 1% should have their wealth distributed for the enrichment of humankind. Oh wait, sorry, wrong 1%. The last percent is a mix of argon, Ar, carbon dioxide, CO2, and a few other trace gases. Now, obviously, CO2 would be a bad idea for an enclosed underwater environment, while argon wouldn't be much better. So, after a lot of testing, that favourite of children's parties was chosen: helium. This is what Gordon Bond, or Papa Topside as he came to be known, was figuring out. And by 1963 he was ready. And President Kennedy approved the Sealab. Sealab 1 was a 40-foot-long, 30-ton, ellipsoid-shaped structure that, in 1964, was sunk 59 meters, or 192 feet, to the bottom of the ocean, somewhere off the coast of Bermuda. There, 4 aquanauts would spend the next 3 weeks completing experiments, learning about the challenges of living underwater, etc. Essentially, being human guinea pigs. Or maybe sea monkeys is more appropriate. Anyway, only hurricanes threatened the area, and they had to be slowly brought up to the surface after only 11 days. Despite the reduced time, the mission had been seen as a success, and Sealab 2 was planned for the next year, 1965. Sealab 2 was nearly twice as big as 1, and had all the luxuries one could want: hot showers, toilets, a refrigerator, and even indoor heating. This last one was very important. It turns out that helium, the thing making up over 70% of their current atmosphere, is one of the highest thermal conductivity gases around. This meant body heat was being wicked away from the aquanauts, and they would be in a constant freezing condition without external heating. Supposedly modern divers will flush their suits with argon or oxygen before a deep dive, creating a pocket of insulating gas to get around this. Helming Sealab 2 was Commander Scott Carpenter, who, just 3 years prior, had flown into space, making him a dual naut, both astro and aqua. Sealab 2 also had a new team member, Tuffy, a specially trained porpoise. Tuffy was able to quickly ferry messages from the surface down to the aquanauts, or supplies from Sealab 2 out to divers. Tuffy also acted as the emergency GPS beacon, and was trained to locate a signal a lost diver would produce, taking a string from them that would lead the diver back to safety. Oh, it should be noted now too, all this time, from the first Sealab through to the second, they had been breathing in the 3-gas mixture of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium. This helium wasn't any different from the stuff you'd find in party balloons, and had the exact same effect on the aquanauts' voices. If you're after a good laugh, type in "Astronaut Scott Carpenter speaks to President Johnson" into YouTube for a first-hand recording of this, and also some very confused telephone operators. All of this brings us to Sealab 3, and the possible murder. Forgot about that little detail, huh? Well, when 3 was sunk down to a record depth of 190 meters, or 610 feet, it was found to be leaking helium at an alarming rate. Rather than try and haul it back up, 4 divers were sent down to fix it. Divers Barth, Blackburn, Reeves, and Berry Cannon. They suffered the freezing conditions in the PTC, Personal Transfer Capsule, to get down to Sealab 3, and then their first attempt to fix it failed. They couldn't get the hatch open to get inside. During their second attempt, 2 divers went out, Barth and Cannon, while the other 2 stayed in the PTC. This dive was also looking to be a failed attempt, but before all of them were exhausted, a scream cut through the water. Barth quickly swam over and found Cannon convulsing, his mouthpiece flailing around his head. He couldn't force it back between his teeth, and had to swim him quickly back to the PTC, hauling them both along lines not meant to take the weight of 1 man, let alone 2. Pulled back in, Attempts were made to save Berry Cannon, and the PTC was quickly being winched back to the surface. But the divers radioed up. Berry Cannon was dead. It would eventually be discovered that Berry's barrelime canister was empty. This was a device meant for scrubbing the carbon dioxide divers exhaled, to prevent a deadly buildup. A tragic and fatal error made by the Navy personnel whose job it had been to replace this solution each dive. Or was it just an error? The remaining 3 divers had to spend a week in a pressurized environment to wait out the bends, but their oxygen supply kept being interrupted. Eventually, a guard had to be placed by the supply, and the interruption stopped. Supposedly, a suspect was identified, but maybe to avoid further negativity, they were never prosecuted. Following the death of Aquanaut Berry, further Sealab programs were scrapped, and the experiment came to an end. Now, a song. I had one in mind. I had heard it a few times last year, but for the life of me, I can't remember the name of it now. And being an indie song, the few fragments of lyrics I can remember just don't appear online. So, in light of that lapse, instead, let's go with a more obvious pick. Back in the year 2000, on the same network that would produce Aqua Teen Hunger Force, the focus of our January 31st story, a show called Sealab 2021 was released. So, my choice of song for this story is a cover of the Sealab 2021 theme done by King of Summer. On this day, not year, of Tuesday, February 18th, Guernsey cow, Elm Farm Ollie, found herself not only travelling faster than she had ever travelled before, but also doing so some 5,000 feet up in the air. This is a story of the cow that jumped over the moon. No, just kidding. This is a story of the first cow to fly on a plane. The year was 1930, and an international aircraft exhibition was being held in St. Louis, Missouri, from February 15th to the 23rd. All this was in the effort to drum up more interest in aviation and the industry, which had been plummeting from the start of the Great Depression the year prior. Although manufacturers had plenty of planes, they didn't have the customers. It was hoped that this show would turn that around. Special stamps were made for the occasion, conferences would be held discussing aviation education and a host of other topics. Stunts and demonstrations were even promised, while over 40 plane manufacturers would be showing off their latest and greatest products. Boeing was even there. Famous pilots were also invited to show off to the public. One of these was Edward Stinson, a World War I flight instructor and a stunt flyer, who would go on to die 2 years later in a crash. But he did hold the record as the most experienced pilot at the time in terms of flight hours. While another guest was Eleanor Smith, also known as the Flying Flapper of Freeport, an 18-year-old pilot with numerous endurance flight records and achievements under her belt. And in an ironic animal twist, another famous flying guest was Jimmy Doolittle. While no relation to the fictionalized Doctor, Jimmy would go on to set many flight speed records and take part in a crucial raid during World War II. Even with all this going on, event organizers wanted more. They needed to put on a spectacle to help boost sales. So for this, they needed firsts. Orville and Wilbur Wright achieved the first powered flight in 1903, with Ada D'Acosta becoming the first woman to fly solo a little while later. But the thought must have gone, what about animals? We don't know why a cow was landed on, but we do know why Elm Farm Ollie was eventually chosen. She was cool under pressure. So, on February 18th, 1930, Elm Farm Ollie, also known as Nellie J, was led to a specially prepared Ford trimotor plane. With pilot, reporters, cow, and cow attendants crammed in, they took off. Reaching a speed of 135 miles per hour, or 217 kilometers, and a height of 5,000 feet, or 1,500 meters. Ollie not only became the first cow to fly on a plane, she was also the first cow to be milked on a plane. Ellsworth W. Bunce had the honor of being the first person to milk a cow in flight, and the produced milk was carefully sealed into half-pint paper bottles, parachutes were attached, and with the plane flying over the expo, the milk was parachuted down to the crowd below. The plane landed safely, and the cow that stepped off was no longer known as Elm Farm Ollie or Nellie J, but by a new moniker, Sky Queen. Her flying days behind her, Sky Queen retired to Sunnymead Farm, where she lived for another 8 years before dying of old age. For this story, I'm pairing Jack Stauber song Milk for very obvious reasons. Wednesday, the 19th of February, and the parents of 5-year-old Charlotte May Piersdorf have a problem. It was 1914, and young Charlotte wanted to travel the 70 miles from Grangeville, Idaho, to visit her grandmother in Lewiston, Idaho. Only a train ticket was going to be too expensive. Nearly her father's entire earnings for the day. What were they to do? Fortunately, little Charlotte May weighed 48.5 pounds, or 22 kilograms, so they knew exactly how to get her on that train, and for less than the cost of a ticket. Affixing a 32-cent stamp to her coat, she was addressed to her grandmother and sent off as mail. The parcel post service was introduced January 1st, 1913, the year prior, and allowed many Americans to take advantage of mailing larger parcels, so long as they were under 50 pounds, or 23 kilograms, directly to each other. Of course, many people also exploited such a service while it was still in its infancy. One of the more famous examples of exploitation can be found in Vernal, Utah, with what locals took to calling the Parcel Post Bank. Built by W. H. Colthorpe in 1917, the bank was constructed with some 80,000 bricks that had to be shipped from Salt Lake City nearly 2,000 miles away. Freight charges to have the bricks delivered were astronomical, being around 4 times the cost of just producing them. Fortunately for Mr. Colthorpe, the postal service was delivering, and it was going to be a lot cheaper to mail the bricks than to send them as freight. So, bundling the bricks up into 50-pound packages, to not go over the limit per parcel, he mailed off the bank 1 bundle at a time. This started to be quite the burden on the young postal service, and the postmaster of the time is recorded writing in a letter, "It is not the intent of the United States Postal Service that buildings be shipped through the mail." And the 50-pound parcel ruling soon found an addendum joining it, with no more than 200 pounds per sender per day. But this change came too late, as all of the bricks had been sent by then. The bank still stands in Vermal, Utah today, and is still even used as a city bank. Parcels of bricks weren't the only things overwhelming the service. Many college kids, away from home for the first time, were quickly discovering the realities of life, mainly in washing. The dirty laundry was piling up. However, many figured out that a parcel to home and back was far cheaper than doing the chore themselves, and soon parents around the country were receiving boxes and boxes of dirty laundry to wash and ship back to their children. But back to Charlotte May. She arrived safely and was delivered to her grandmother. The story was even written and picked up by different newspapers around America. This, of course, led to another problem for the Postal Service. After all, if one person can post a child, why can't others? While she wasn't the first kid to be mailed by post, Charlotte was perhaps the most famous example, and the one which forced the United States postal system to change and update their rule and ban the postage of humans. While it's entirely the wrong continent, my song pairing for this story comes from the band Public Service Broadcasting, who put archived news stories and sounds to music. Their song Night Mail is perfect for this story, but everything they have done is well worth a listen. Thursday, the 20th of February, and on this day, not year, imagine you are standing outside, doing a bit of gardening. Suddenly, a crack forms in the earth beside you. The world shakes, and with a thundering noise, the crack widens, and a mountain of earth starts rising out from within, spewing smoke and the smell of sulfur. Congratulations! You just witnessed the birth of a new volcano. On this day in 1943, Dionisio Pulido of Paracutin, Mexico, witnessed this exact sight, as a new volcano was birthed in his yard, right in the middle of a cornfield. Frightened for his own safety, but even more so for his family, Dionisio recalls, "I couldn't find my wife, or my son, or my animals. I looked into the fissure where the smoke was rising, and my fear disappeared for the first time. I ran to see if I could save my family, my companions, and my oxen, but I could not see them, and I thought that they must have taken the oxen to the spring for water. I saw that there was no water in the spring, and I thought the water had gone because of the fissure. I was very frightened, and I mounted my mare and galloped to Paracutin, where I found my wife and son and friends waiting for me. They were afraid that I was dead and they would never see me again." More than just a popcorn moment for scientists, this was a chance to study the formation of a volcano, live and in real time. What followed was 9 years of growth and eruptions as the volcano continued to grow. After one day, it was now 50 meters tall, with villagers watching on at night as spouts of fire, rising hundreds of meters into the air, burst from the volcano and lit up the sky like fireworks. After a week, the Paracutin volcano was now over 100 meters tall. After a few dangerous months, the lava flows from the volcano began to spread towards the Paracutin village, eventually covering it entirely. A second town was threatened later when the volcano began to spread further, and soon San Juan Paringaricutirio was also abandoned. The church, half buried in now solidified lava and rocky debris, has become a tourist attraction for the area. And still, the volcano continued to grow. By the end of year 1, it had reached its current height of 450 meters, or 1,475 feet tall. It continued to spread lava over the surrounding countryside. At one stage, in 1944, a stream 25 miles wide threatened 3 towns, forcing residents to flee. 10 years after it first emerged, it was estimated to have distributed over 2.2 billion tons of ashes, hot rocks, and lava from the depths of the earth. The ash and lava killed off plants and crops for kilometers around the volcano, in an area that, before 1943, had relied heavily on the farming trade. In total, 2 populations had to evacuate to escape the birth and tantrum of this new volcano. Although no one died as a direct result from the lava or rock bombardment, 3 people were killed by lightning. As a quick aside, volcanic lightning, or a dirty thunderstorm, can occur within all the ejected ash and debris, as it generates enough static charge above the volcano to produce lightning. So, if you're ever unlucky enough to be near an active volcano, maybe avoid umbrellas and tall trees. At just 81 years old, this is one of the youngest volcanoes on Earth, with many people alive today who are older than the youngest volcano. Although the Paracutin is now dormant, it still produces a lot of heat, and on rainy days steam can be seen rising out of the crater. As for what happened to Dionisio Pulido, I don't know. But, reportedly, his last visit to the volcano saw him erect a sign that simply read, "This volcano is owned and operated by Dionisio Pulido." While some Johnny Cash would be more than appropriate for this story, with some burning ring of fire, the song coming out 20 years after the volcano formed, instead let's go with Fire and Brimstone by Wray. The apocalyptic messaging is likely more in tune with how the fleeing villagers felt at the time. Friday, 21st of February, and on this day, not year, oh, the humanity! A phrase that, if you're of a certain generation, probably brings to mind the fiery crash of the Hindenburg airship in 1937. The airship crash shown around the world, that many cite to be the direct reason we don't have airships around today, and why the docking moor atop the Empire State Building remains empty. But, did you know, not only wasn't the Hindenburg the last airship to crash, it wasn't even the first. In fact, the date of the last crash may surprise you. But for now, let's look at an earlier airship and an earlier crash. The Roma, or Model T-34, was built by Italy in 1920. At 125 meters long, a height of 28 meters, a speed of 128 kilometers per hour, and easily able to carry 100 passengers over 4,800 kilometers, the Roma was cutting edge for the time, the largest semi-rigid airship in the world. Which is why the American Air Force wanted it, and were willing to pay top dollar too, handing over $184,000 in 1921 for the airship, an amount equivalent to about 3.2 million USD today, which, considering the cost of a single F-35 fighter jet today is estimated at between 80 to 115 million USD, that's not too bad of a price they paid. Just as an aside, that 80 to 115 million would be 7 to 10 billion Russian rubles, just for those wondering. Rather than fly the Roma back from Italy to America, a trip Google is telling me is a little over 9,000 kilometers, and would have taken the airship just under 3 days at top speed, although likely a refueling stop along the way would add some time, plus you'd want to get out and stretch your legs a little. Where was I? Rather than flying back, they opted to ship the airship back to America, but found some mold and mildew when they unpacked it on arrival. After taking a few months to put it back together, arriving back in August and only having their first home flight in November, they kept encountering problems. One flight saw the propeller break and rip the ship open. Another, the engines couldn't handle the cool weather and had to be replaced. Then came February 21st, 1922. The ship was to go on a test flight around America, a holiday jaunt, those on the trip had taken to calling it, filled with nearly all the helium in the country at the time. Safe, non-flammable helium. Someone instead made the call to empty and store the helium and replace it all with ordinary balloon gas, or hydrogen gas. Unfortunately for the crew of 45 on board, the spate of bad luck continued for the Roma, and witnesses on the ground reported the ship becoming uncontrollable when the rudder box of the airship slipped sideways. The ship dove towards the ground from 1,000 feet or 300 meters up, with crew throwing out sandbags, ballast and other items, all to no effect. Just before contact, it clipped some high-voltage power lines, sparking the hydrogen and engulfing the entire ship in intense flames. The final words of Captain Mabry, who had been fighting the controls the entire way down, were reportedly, "Goodbye, boys." Those on the ground report horror stories in the events immediately after. One crew member attempted to utilize a parachute, only to be too close to the ground. Other crash survivors fled from the flames, fully engulfed themselves, but too far away from water or help. After the flames had died down, and help arrived, 34 of the 45 passengers and crew were deceased. Of the survivors, 8 were seriously injured, and 3 somehow were fine. 5 even having cut their way through the burning canvas with a lone knife a lieutenant happened to be carrying. But I bet even after all that, you're still thinking to yourself, okay, but what was the more recent airship crash then? Well, let me put your mind to ease. The ADB-3-3 is produced by the Airship do Brasil Company, and while advertising for a local football club, the airship lost a lot of helium and crashed down into a residential building. Fortunately, the 2 pilots survived, and the building was left intact too. As for when all this happened, September 25th, 2024. Oh, another story where burning ring of fire is oddly appropriate. Instead, let's go with something a little less well known, with the band Pinataland, from their Songs for the Forgotten Future album, with the song Velocity. On this day, not year, of Saturday 22nd of February, a new play opened on Broadway. New York Times reviewer Frank Rich said of the play, "From now on there will always be 2 groups of theatergoers in the world, those who have seen Moose Murders and those who have not." Was the production then that good, for those who had not seen it to be so segregated? No, they were the luckiest of the 2 groups. Moose Murders not only opened on this night back in 1983, but it also closed this day and date too. Moose Murders, brainchild of Arthur Bicknell, a playwright who, up until 1983, was fairly unknown. He had 2 moderately successful scripts under his belt, but they had been more serious affairs. Then, like so many before him, he had wanted to dip his toes into the seemingly placid lake of comedy, only to come away a few shy of the usual 10. With fond memories of family vacations as a child, and further inspiration from public access television, Bicknell wanted to create, in his words, people who are being funny and don't know it. So, what was Moose Murders about? Unfortunately for actors, but fortunately for us, the script is still sold online. And while I didn't want to part with a tenner to purchase it, the plot synopsis is as follows. The well-heeled hairs of a wealthy but ailing old man named Sidney Holloway have purchased the Wild Moose Lodge in the Adirondacks as a place for Daddy to live out his last days. During an innocuous game of murder, suggested by one of the clan, the mousy young Lorraine Holloway is murdered for real. Who done it? Could it have been the legendary Butcher Moose that haunts the mountains? Or is it a member, or members, of the eccentric Holloway family itself? A director for the script was found with John Roach, who only agreed to take the job if he could cast his wife, Lilith Robertson, in a role. Ultimately, she would play Lorraine, the first victim in the story. Legendary Hollywood actress Eve Arden was approached to play Hedda Holloway, the wife of dying Sidney, but rejected the offer, before she eventually decided to take it, and then quit during staged previews, citing creative differences, while others claimed she just couldn't remember the lines. Eventually, Holland Taylor would take the role, barely having enough time to learn the script. Besides a writer's first attempt at comedy, and a revolving cast of actors, why is Moose Murders regarded as such a flop? Why is it often the bar for which theatre flops are judged? Well, that's all to do with the writing. Spoilers ahead, but a basic rundown of the plot goes as follows. The Holloways buy the Old Moose Lodge, but a husband and wife duo, Howie, who is blind, and Snooks, tone-deaf, keen, don't want to vacate, despite the insistence of their racially appropriating landlord, Joe Buffalo Dance. Hedda and Sydney Holloway have 3 kids, Gay, Stinky, and Lorraine. Gay is a tap-dancing, attention-seeking, martini-wanting 12-year-old. Stinky is a hippie with an Oedipus complex, while Lorraine is just attention-starved. Lorraine, together with her husband Nelson Fay, are seeking to murder the family for the inheritance money during their stay at the lodge. Only Nelson is actually working together with Sydney's caretaker, Nurse Dagmar, although in reality it's a triple cross and he's in love with Hedda, the mother, and together they are attempting to kill everyone. By the end of the play, Lorraine has been killed, strangled, Joe Buffalo Dance shot while pretending to be the butcher moose, Stinky possibly killed by his mother, it's not really clear, Nurse Dagmar killed by Sydney, who was actually Nelson in disguise, with the real Sydney killed off-screen by a vegetable peeler. Then the play closes with Hedda and Nelson offering Gay and Howie and Snooks Keen poisoned vodka martinis to kill them all off. Outside of the racial appropriation, incest jokes, heavy reliance on stereotypes, and real lack of comedy, it's not too far off a terrible episode of Scooby-Doo, which was perhaps its biggest downfall. The play did nothing original, and of that, it did nothing well. Ironically, one of the opening lines of the script, from blind singer Howie Keane, is, "I don't sense an audience," which was quite prophetic, as the theatre had failed to sell a majority of its tickets, and the few who did turn up remained mostly silent at the jokes. Only writer Arthur Bicknell himself providing the most laughter. Closing down the night it opened, after critic reviews poured in, lambasting the play for how poor it was. Ironically, the following night people were lined up around the block for tickets, hoping to see how bad it could actually be, only to walk away disappointed again by the play in finding it had already closed. And that ends my take on Moose Murders, but it doesn't have to end yours. If you are so inclined to self-flagellation, an amateur theatre group's production from 1990 is up on YouTube. If you search for Moose Murders WHPHS Fall Drama 1990, you can give it a watch yourself. So, to close out this February 22nd, the only appropriate song I can pair this story with is from the almost scarily predictive The Producers, with the song Opening Night. Which brings us to Sunday, 23rd of February, and on this day, not year, some creative cheating at the 1958 Grand Prix in Cuba. Established the year prior by President Batista, the hot favorite of the '58 event was Juan Manuel Fangio, winner of the 1957 Grand Prix, and had also set the fastest lap in the practice laps. So, when race day came, and Fangio was missing, President Batista was furious. After all, he had paid Fangio a lot of money to be in this race, likely hoping to draw larger crowds, sponsors, and competition. Where was Juan Manuel Fangio? Kidnapped. The night prior, at 8:55 p.m., Two armed revolutionaries, members of the 26th of July movement, had burst into Fangio's hotel, and rather politely stated, "I am from the 26th of July movement, and we are kidnapping you," before they bundled him up and away to a safe house. They had been watching Fangio for days, and although came brandishing guns, had no intention of harming him. Their true aim was to embarrass President Batista by shutting down his precious Grand Prix. Having risen to presidency thanks to a United States-endorsed military coup in 1952, Fulgencio Batista enjoyed the finest things in life, at the expense of the poorer Cubans. And the Americans, of course, profited from all of this too. Without getting too deep into the topic for today, this all leads up to the Cuban Missile Crisis and America's embargo on Cuba. But back to Fangio and the kidnappers. Having arrived at their first safe house, they found it was already occupied, so sped away to a second. Anecdotally, as they were speeding away, it's reported that Fangio, champion race car driver, suggested the kidnappers slow down a little. In the second safe house, he was allowed a radio to listen into the race, and after a move to a third and final safe house, a television was even brought in for him to watch a replay of it. Juan Fangio would later tell the police he had been treated very well, as though I was a friend of the rebels. He had been well fed, and even had a lady in a low-cut dress as a dining partner. Whenever the rebels attempted to engage him in politics or about the president, he would rebuff them, simply saying, "I am a racing driver." Still, he seemingly held no animosity towards the rebels. Having been released after 29 hours, he stated he wouldn't be able to identify anyone, as he had seen too many people. And as for the race, well, a crash early on by one of the drivers into a retaining wall had seen 4 audience members killed, with a further 2 succumbing to their injuries later, and the drivers all voted to call the race off. As for a fitting song for this story, I think the lyrics of Talking Heads' Road to Nowhere are quite fitting for a kidnapped racing driver held captive by a group of rebels looking to topple a dictator. And that would be the end of another episode of TDNY. But I did promise something new, didn't I? I also told you to take notes, and I hope you have been, as today will end on a quiz. See how it goes. If people like the idea, it can continue. If not, it'll be easy enough to drop. So, let's get to it. Nothing too difficult. Question 1. What was the name of the porpoise with a purpose in Sealab 2? Question 2. What was Elm Farm Ollie's new name upon landing? Question 3. What were college kids sending back by parcel mail to their parents? Question 4. How old is the young volcano from Thursday's story? Question 5. What is safer for an airship, hydrogen or helium? Question 6. In Moose Murders, who croaked first? And question 7. How long was Juan Manuel Fangio held prisoner for? Feel free to rewind if you didn't hear a question the first time. Now on to the answers. The porpoise was of course named Tuffy. Elm Farm Ollie's new name was Sky Queen. College kids were sending back dirty laundry. The young volcano is 81 years old. Helium is the safer of the two for an airship. In Moose Murders, Lorraine dies first. And Fangio was held prisoner for 29 hours. So, were you paying enough attention? How did you do? Either way, this brings us to the end of another episode of TDNY. I hope you've learned something new along the way, or at the very least been kept entertained by these stories and some of the music recommendations. As per, thisdaynotyear@gmail.com for any and all errors, or heck, any recommendations of stories too. I spend a lot of my time trawling the internet for interesting stories that I can cover, so if you've got any recommendations, I'm all for it. Anyway, tune in next week where we'll cover the 24th of February through to the 2nd of March. Thanks for listening, and cheers.